Forest ranger found abandoned backpack in woods, opened it, and called for backup. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a secret trying to hide itself. Ella Navarro adjusted her ranger hat and checked her radio one more time before stepping deeper into Sector D7, a part of the Cascade National Forest that most hikers never bothered to explore. The trail here was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and fallen branches that crunched under her boots with each careful step. She wasn't supposed to be here today. Her original patrol route covered the popular hiking trails near Eagles Peak, but yesterday's incident report had changed everything. Trail camera number 47 had gone dark 3 days ago, not unusual in itself, but this particular camera had been installed to monitor illegal camping activity in one of the forest's most remote sections. Probably just dead batteries, her supervisor had said with a shrug. But take a look anyway. Better safe than sorry. Ella had been a forest ranger for 8 years, and she'd learned to trust her instincts. Something about the camera's sudden silence felt wrong, like a voice going quiet mid-sentence. The forest had its own rhythm, its own patterns, and when those patterns shifted, there was usually a reason. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Somewhere above, a woodpecker hammered against bark in a steady rhythm that echoed through the trees. Ella pulled out her GPS device and confirmed her location. She was still half a mile from where camera 47 should be, but already the landscape felt different. Wilder. More isolated. She paused at a fallen log that blocked the narrow trail and climbed over it, her boots finding purchase on the moss-covered bark. On the other side, the forest opened into a small clearing that didn't appear on any of the official maps. Ancient pine trees formed a rough circle around a patch of grass and wildflowers that swayed gently in the morning breeze. It was beautiful, peaceful even, but something made Ella stop and scan the area more carefully. Her trained eye caught details that most people would miss. The way the grass grew in slightly different patterns in one corner, how the soil looked darker in a specific spot, the absence of small animal tracks in what should have been prime foraging territory. She walked slowly toward the center of the clearing, her boots silent on the soft earth. The sun had climbed higher now, burning away the morning mist and casting dappled shadows through the canopy above. Birds chirped in the distance, but here in this clearing, everything felt unusually quiet. Near the base of the largest pine tree, something caught her attention. The earth looked disturbed, not recently, but not ancient either. The grass grew thinner here, and when she knelt down, she could see that the soil had been moved and then carefully replaced. Someone had tried to make it look natural, but they hadn't quite succeeded. Ella pulled on her work gloves and began brushing away the loose dirt and pine needles. Her fingers found something solid buried just inches below the surface. She worked carefully, the way she'd been trained to handle evidence, though she wasn't sure yet if that's what this was. The object felt like fabric, waterproof fabric. She cleared away more soil and saw a flash of dark blue material. A backpack. Someone had buried a backpack under this tree and tried to hide all traces of it. Her heart rate quickened slightly. In 8 years of ranger work, she'd found plenty of things that didn't belong in the forest: abandoned camping gear, lost hiking equipment, even the occasional illegal marijuana grow operation. But she'd never found anything deliberately buried and concealed like this. The backpack was old but well-made, the kind serious hikers used for multi-day expeditions. The zippers were corroded and the fabric was stained with moisture and mold, suggesting it had been underground for months, maybe longer. But what struck Ella most was how carefully it had been hidden. This wasn't someone losing their gear or abandoning it carelessly. Someone had specifically wanted this backpack to disappear. She lifted it carefully from its shallow grave, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside, it wasn't just clothes and camping supplies. The backpack made soft, shifting sounds as she moved it, like it contained books or papers, maybe electronic equipment. Standing in the silent clearing with the mysterious backpack in her hands, Ella felt the familiar tingle of intuition that had served her well over the years. This wasn't just another piece of litter or abandoned gear. This was something important, something that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. She looked around the clearing one more time, noting the position of the sun, the specific trees, the lay of the land. If this was evidence of something, she needed to document everything carefully. But first, she needed to see what was inside that backpack. The walk back to her truck seemed longer than usual, every shadow appearing more threatening, every sound in the forest seeming amplified. Ella couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though she saw no sign of another human presence. The backpack felt heavier with each step, as if whatever secrets it contained were pulling her deeper into something she didn't yet understand. When she finally reached her vehicle parked on the access road, Ella placed the backpack carefully in the bed of her truck and stood looking back at the forest. Somewhere in those trees, camera 47 was still dark and silent. Somewhere in that peaceful clearing, someone had buried evidence of something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. And now, whether she liked it or not, Ella Navarro was about to become part of their story. Ella sat in the cab of her truck with the engine idling, air conditioning humming softly as she stared at the moldy backpack on the passenger seat. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows through the windshield, but she barely noticed. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the main zipper, not from fear, but from anticipation. In her 8 years as a ranger, she developed an instinct for when something was about to change everything. The zipper fought her at first, corroded from months underground, but finally gave way with a wet, tearing sound. The smell that escaped made her wrinkle her nose, musty fabric, damp earth, and something else she couldn't identify. Something metallic and sharp. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a clear plastic bag, she found the first item. A hand-drawn map on heavy paper that had somehow survived the moisture better than she'd expected. Ella unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized the terrain. Someone had drawn a detailed representation of this section of the forest, complete with landmarks she knew by heart: Finished Horse Creek, the old fire tower, the abandoned logging road that connected to Highway 101. But this wasn't a hiking map. Red X marks dotted the landscape in locations that meant nothing to her, and beside each X, someone had drawn small symbols that looked almost like hieroglyphs. Tree symbols, but not the kind you'd find in any forestry manual. These were crude, angular, almost ritualistic in their design. GPS coordinates were written in neat block letters beside each mark, coordinates that would lead someone to very specific spots deep in the wilderness. "What the hell?" Ella whispered, tracing one of the symbols with her finger. The ink had run slightly from moisture, but the marks were still clear enough to make out. Someone had spent considerable time creating this map, documenting locations throughout her forest with scientific precision. She set the map aside and reached deeper into the backpack. Her fingers found something hard and rectangular, a small digital tape recorder, the kind investigators used for interviews. It was an older model, but the protective case had kept it relatively dry. Ella turned it over in her hands, noting the weight of it, the way the plastic casing had been reinforced with electrical tape. There was a cassette tape inside. With growing unease, she pressed the play button. Static filled the truck's cabin for several seconds before a man's voice emerged from the tiny speaker. It was gravelly, tired, the voice of someone who'd been running on coffee and fear for too long. Day 43. GPS coordinates 47.2431 north, 121.1123 west. The tree symbol, it's fresh. They were here last night, maybe this morning. The bark shavings are still white. A pause, then the sound of papers rustling. If something happens to me, if I don't make it out, someone needs to know what they're doing out here. Check coordinates 47.2455 north, 121.1089 west. Check 47.2467 north, 121.1156 west. The symbols are everywhere now. They're not just marking territory anymore, they're marking burial sites. Ella's blood ran cold. She fumbled for her notebook and scribbled down the coordinates, her handwriting shaky. The voice continued. Day 47. They know I'm watching. Found my first camera smashed, SD card missing. Moving to backup positions. Sarah, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry. I should have listened to you. Should have stayed away from this place. But people need to know what Meridian Industries is really doing with those environmental permits. The recording cut to static, then silence. Ella sat frozen for a moment, processing what she just heard. Meridian Industries, she knew that name. They'd been in the local papers last year, something about land development contracts and environmental impact studies. But burial sites? What kind of burial sites? She reached into the backpack again and found the third item, a manila envelope containing dozens of Polaroid photographs. Her hands were steadier now, driven by professional curiosity rather than nervous energy. She spread the photos across her dashboard like a detective working a case. The images showed trees throughout the forest, but these weren't nature photographs. Each picture focused on carved symbols and bark, the same angular, hieroglyphic-style marks from the hand-drawn map. Some carvings looked old, weathered by seasons of rain and snow. Others appeared fresh, the wood pale and raw where it had been recently cut. But it was the final photograph that made Ella's stomach drop. She recognized the tree immediately, a massive Douglas fir about 2 miles from where she sat, distinctive because of its unusual double trunk. She'd walked past that tree hundreds of times during her patrols. The symbol carved into its bark in the photograph was crisp and clean, the wood so fresh it looked white against the dark bark. According to the timestamp on the photo, it had been taken just 6 days ago. Someone was still out there, still active, still carving these symbols into her forest. And according to the voice on the tape, they were marking burial sites. Ella gathered the photographs, folded the map, and tucked the tape recorder into her jacket pocket. Her mind raced with questions, but one thought dominated all others. She needed to see that Douglas fir with her own eyes. She needed to confirm what she was beginning to suspect, that this wasn't just about some old mystery. This was happening now, in her forest, under her watch. As she started the truck and pulled back onto the access road, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that opening that backpack had changed everything. The man on the tape had disappeared trying to expose something, and now she held the only evidence of whatever he'd discovered. The question was, would she disappear too? The coordinates from the tape recorder led Ella deeper into the forest than she'd ventured in months. She left her truck parked at the intersection of 2 logging roads and continued on foot, following her GPS through increasingly dense undergrowth. The morning was warming up, and sweat beaded on her forehead as she pushed through a tangle of blackberry vines that caught at her uniform sleeves. According to her device, she was less than 50 yards from the first set of coordinates the man on the tape had mentioned. The forest here felt different, older, more primal. The canopy above was so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor, creating an almost twilight atmosphere despite the bright day above. She found the tree exactly where the GPS said it would be. The Douglas fir rose nearly 200 feet into the sky, its trunk so massive that it would take 4 people holding hands to encircle it. But what made Ella's pulse quicken was the symbol carved into its bark at eye level, the same angular, mysterious mark she'd seen in the Polaroids, but this one was different. This one was fresh. Very fresh. The carved lines were clean and precise, cutting deep into the living wood. White sap still oozed from the wounds, and when Ella touched the bark around the symbol, tiny wood shavings fell to the ground like snow. This carving couldn't be more than a day or 2 old. Jesus, she whispered, stepping back to photograph the symbol with her phone. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew exactly where to find this tree and exactly what symbol to carve into it. As she lowered her phone, something else caught her attention. Scattered around the base of the tree were cigarette butts, not old, weathered ones that had been there through multiple seasons, but fresh ones with white filters and intact tobacco. She counted 7 of them, all the same brand, all dropped in a rough circle around the tree. Someone had stood here smoking while they worked. Someone who felt comfortable enough to take their time. Ella pulled out an evidence bag from her ranger kit and carefully collected the cigarette butts. She wasn't a cop, but she'd worked with law enforcement enough times to know that DNA could be extracted from filters, that forensics could tell investigators more than they'd expect from seemingly innocent litter. She was sealing the evidence bag when she heard it, a soft, mechanical click from somewhere above her head. Ella froze, every instinct screaming that she wasn't alone. The sound had come from about 20 feet up, hidden in the dense foliage of a neighboring hemlock tree. She scanned the branches carefully, looking for anything that didn't belong in the natural environment. There, a small, dark object mounted to a branch and pointed directly at the carved Douglas fir. A trail camera, but not one of the Forest Service's standard models. This was military-grade equipment, the kind used for serious surveillance operations. "Son of a bitch," Ella muttered. Someone wasn't just carving symbols into trees, they were documenting who found them. She studied the camera's position, calculating angles and approach routes. Whoever had installed it had chosen the location carefully, ensuring a clear view of the symbol, while keeping the camera hidden from casual observation. But they'd made one mistake. They'd positioned it low enough that someone with ranger training could reach it. Ella found a sturdy branch on the Douglas fir and pulled herself up, grateful for the physical conditioning that came with her job. The climb was awkward with her equipment belt, but she managed to work her way high enough to reach across to the hemlock where the camera was mounted. Up close, she could see that the device was sophisticated: weatherproof housing, infrared capability, wireless transmission antenna. This wasn't some hunter's game camera or amateur wildlife enthusiast setup. This was professional surveillance equipment, the kind that cost thousands of dollars and required technical expertise to install properly. The camera was motion activated, and a small LED light indicated it was currently recording. Ella's arrival had triggered it, which meant that someone might be watching her right now through a live feed. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but it also steeled her resolve. She carefully detached the camera from its mounting bracket, noting the serial numbers and manufacturer information. The SD card slot was accessible, and she ejected the memory card with steady fingers despite her racing heart. As she climbed back down to ground level, Ella's mind raced with the implications of what she'd discovered. This wasn't random vandalism or some weird hiking ritual. This was systematic surveillance of specific forest locations, conducted by people with serious resources and technical capabilities. The man on the tape had mentioned Meridian Industries and environmental permits. Now she was looking at evidence of an organized operation that involved carving symbols, monitoring those symbols with expensive cameras, and somehow connecting it all to burial sites. Standing at the base of the giant Douglas fir with the surveillance camera in one hand and the SD card in the other, Ella realized she'd crossed a line. She was no longer just investigating mysterious evidence. She was actively interfering with someone else's operation. Someone who clearly had the resources and motivation to monitor their activities very carefully. The forest around her suddenly felt less like her familiar workplace and more like a potential trap. Every shadow could hide another camera, another watcher, another person who might not appreciate her curiosity. But there was no going back now. The SD card in her hand might contain answers to questions that had started with a dead trail camera and a buried backpack. Whatever was happening in her forest, whatever Meridian Industries was really doing with those environmental permits, she was going to find out. Even if it meant she was being watched every step of the way. She pocketed the SD card and started back toward her truck, moving more carefully now, scanning the trees for other cameras, other signs of surveillance. The man on the tape had disappeared trying to expose this operation. Ella was determined not to make the same mistake he had. Back at the ranger station, Ella locked the door to her office and drew the blinds before inserting the SD card into her computer. Her hands were steadier now, driven by professional determination rather than nervous energy. Whatever was on this card, she needed to document it properly before deciding her next move. The SD card contained 847 files, photographs and video clips spanning 3 months. Ella organized them by date and started with the oldest entries. The first images showed the Douglas fir during daylight hours, with the symbol already carved into its bark. Wildlife moved through the frame occasionally: deer, raccoons, even a black bear that paused to scratch against the tree. But for weeks, nothing unusual appeared. Then the nighttime activity began. The first video file that made Ella's stomach clench was dated 2 months ago. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. when a pickup truck appeared at the edge of the frame, its headlights casting harsh shadows across the forest floor. Two men got out, but the infrared imaging made their faces difficult to distinguish. They moved with purpose, unloading shovels and what looked like metal detectors from the truck bed. "What the hell are you doing?" Ella whispered to her computer screen. She watched as the men spent nearly an hour scanning the ground around the carved tree with their metal detectors. When they found what they were looking for, they began digging. The hole they created was roughly rectangular, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. They worked efficiently, like people who'd done this before. Ella fast-forwarded through the digging process, her unease growing with each frame. When the men finished, they lifted something heavy from the back of their truck, a metal crate about the size of a footlocker. The infrared camera couldn't reveal details, but whatever was in that crate required both men to carry it. They lowered the crate into the hole, covered it with dirt, and spent another 20 minutes arranging fallen branches and debris over the burial site. When they were finished, the ground looked undisturbed, as natural as if nothing had ever been buried there. The men drove away at 2:33 a.m., leaving no trace of their visit except for the footage captured by the hidden camera. Ella leaned back in her chair, processing what she just witnessed. The coordinates on the hand-drawn map weren't marking random locations. They were marking burial sites where people were secretly burying metal crates in the middle of the night. She scrolled through more files, finding similar scenes recorded at different dates. Always at night, always the same two men, always the same routine of metal detection, digging, burying, and concealment. The most recent burial had occurred just 5 days ago. But it was video file 847 that made everything clear. The timestamp showed 3 nights ago, 1:15 a.m. The same pickup truck arrived, but this time something was different. As the men began their usual routine, a third figure appeared at the edge of the frame, someone moving stealthily through the trees, staying in the shadows. The hidden observer watched the burial process from a distance, occasionally raising what looked like a camera to document the activity. When the men finished and drove away, the observer waited several minutes before approaching the freshly disturbed earth. Ella watched in fascination as the mysterious figure examined the burial site, took photographs, and then did something unexpected. He looked directly up at the surveillance camera. The infrared imaging captured his face clearly for just a moment, and Ella recognized him from missing person reports that had crossed her desk months ago. Marcus Webb, a freelance investigative journalist who'd been researching environmental permit fraud. He disappeared 11 months ago while working on a story about illegal land use in national forests. "The man on the tape," Ella breathed. "You were still alive 3 days ago." But then she saw what happened next, and her blood turned to ice. One of the men from the truck reappeared in the frame, moving silently through the trees behind Marcus Webb. The journalist was so focused on documenting the burial site that he never saw his pursuer approaching. The man raised something in his hand, a rock or a heavy branch, and struck Webb in the back of the head. The journalist collapsed instantly. What followed was the most chilling footage Ella had ever seen. The attacker dragged Webb's unconscious body to the fresh burial site, rolled him into the hole, and began shoveling dirt over him. Webb never moved, never struggled. Within 20 minutes, he was buried in the same grave as the metal crate. The criminal then walked directly to the camera and looked up at it, his face clearly visible in the infrared imaging. He was smiling. He raised his hand and gave a small wave, as if greeting someone he knew was watching. Then he picked up a large rock and smashed the camera. The video ended in static. Ella sat in stunned silence, staring at the black screen. She just watched a crime. The man whose voice had guided her to this discovery, whose desperate warnings had led her down this rabbit hole, had been finished 3 days ago and buried with whatever illegal cargo Meridian Industries was hiding in the forest. She ejected the SD card with trembling fingers and sealed it in an evidence bag. The cigarette butts, the surveillance footage, the hand-drawn map, she had enough evidence to bring down what appeared to be a major criminal operation. But she also had evidence that the people running this operation were willing to finish to protect their secrets. Her office phone rang, making her jump. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Cascade Ranger Station, this is Navarro, she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Ranger Navarro, said a man's voice she didn't recognize. I think you found something that belongs to us. We'd like it back. Ella's hand tightened on the phone receiver, her training kicking in despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. I'm sorry, who is this? Someone who's been watching you have a very productive day, the voice replied, smooth and conversational. The backpack, the camera, the SD card, impressive detective work for a forest ranger. But you're in over your head now, Ms. Navarro. The line went dead. Ella stared at the phone, her mind racing. They knew everything. They'd been watching her just as they'd watched Marcus Webb, tracking her movements, monitoring her investigation. The surveillance network in the forest was bigger than just one camera. They had eyes everywhere. She grabbed the evidence bag containing the SD card and shoved it into her jacket pocket along with the cigarette butts and photographs. Whatever happened next, she couldn't let this evidence disappear like Marcus Webb had. She needed to get it to law enforcement, but first she had to get out of the ranger station alive. Ella's radio crackled to life. All units be advised. Reports of suspicious activity in Sector D7. Requesting additional patrols in the area. That was her sector. They were drawing other rangers into the area, either to help her or to ensure there were witnesses to whatever they planned to do next. Either way, she couldn't stay here. She locked the evidence in her desk drawer and headed for the door, but stopped when she saw headlights turning into the station parking lot. A dark SUV with tinted windows pulled up next to her truck and sat idling, the occupants invisible behind the darkened glass. Ella backed away from the window and grabbed her emergency radio. She needed to return to Sector D7, needed to document the burial site where Marcus Webb had been finished. If something happened to her, at least there would be a record of where to look. She slipped out the back door of the station and made her way through the trees to where her personal vehicle was parked in the employee lot. The SUV was still sitting by the main entrance, waiting. 20 minutes later, Ella was back in the forest, but this time she wasn't alone. She'd called her supervisor and requested backup for what she'd described as potential environmental crimes in progress. Help was coming, but it would take at least an hour for additional rangers to reach the remote location. An hour might be too long. She parked her truck at the same logging road intersection and continued on foot, moving more cautiously than before. Every shadow could hide a watcher, every sound could signal an ambush. The forest that had been her sanctuary for 8 years now felt like enemy territory. The Douglas fir with the carved symbol came into view through the trees, and Ella immediately knew something was wrong. The area around the tree looked different. The ground had been disturbed again, and there were fresh tire tracks in the soft earth. As she approached the tree, she could see that the burial site had been excavated. A gaping hole marked the spot where Marcus Webb and the metal crate had been buried just 3 days ago. Both were gone. Looking for something? Ella spun around, her hand instinctively moving to the pepper spray on her belt. A man stepped out from behind a neighboring tree, the same face she'd seen in the infrared footage, the criminal who'd finished Marcus Webb and waved at the camera. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the lean build of someone who spent time outdoors. He wore hiking clothes that looked expensive, and his boots were the kind serious mountaineers used. He could have been any outdoor enthusiast, except for the pistol in his right hand. The journalist was getting too close, the man said conversationally. Started asking questions about our environmental permits, wondering why Meridian Industries needed access to such remote locations. Curiosity finished the cat, as they say. Ella's mind raced, calculating distances and escape routes. She was at least 50 yards from dense cover, too far to run without being shot. Her only chance was to keep him talking and hope her backup arrived soon. "What's in the crates?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The man smiled. "Nothing that concerns forest rangers. Let's just say some people pay very well to have certain items disappear permanently. National Forest land is perfect for that kind of storage, remote, protected, rarely disturbed. At least, it was rarely disturbed until you came along. Behind him, Ella caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. More men, positioned to cut off any escape routes. They'd planned this carefully, just like they'd planned Marcus Webb's finishing. The SD card? The man continued. Where is it? Ella's hand moved slowly toward her radio. Safe. Along with copies of everything on it. That was a lie, but it might buy her time. The man's expression hardened. I don't think so. You see, we've been monitoring your communications all day. No calls to law enforcement, no file transfers, no backup copies. You've been working alone, just like the journalist did. He raised the pistol. Just like him, you're about to disappear. Ella's finger found the emergency button on her radio just as she heard the sound that would save her life, the distant rumble of vehicles approaching on the logging road. Her backup was arriving early. This is Navarro. She spoke quickly into the radio. Possible illegal ops near Sector D7, GPS coordinates 47.2431 north, 121.1123 west. Request backup. Now. The criminal's eyes widened as he realized what she'd done. The sound of engines was getting closer, and soon the forest would be filled with law enforcement officers who would want answers about disturbed burial sites and missing persons. You have no idea what you started, he said, backing toward the trees where his accomplices waited. But Ella was no longer listening. She was thinking about Marcus Webb, about the evidence locked in her desk, about the criminal network that had been using her forest as a dumping ground for whatever illegal cargo they transported. Whatever happened next, she'd made sure they couldn't simply make her disappear like they had the journalist. The cavalry was coming. The sound of vehicles grew louder, and within minutes the forest erupted with activity. FBI agents in tactical gear emerged from unmarked SUVs, followed by local law enforcement and Forest Service investigators. Ella had never been so relieved to see a badge in her life. The criminal and his accomplices melted into the forest like shadows, but they didn't get far. Helicopters appeared overhead, and K-9 units were already tracking their scent through the undergrowth. This wasn't just a random backup response. This was a coordinated federal operation that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Ranger Navarro? A woman in a dark suit approached, flashing FBI credentials. Agent Sarah Chin. We've been investigating Meridian Industries for 18 months. Your radio call just gave us the probable cause we needed to move. Ella stared at her in amazement. You knew about this? We suspected, Chen replied. Marcus Webb wasn't just a freelance journalist. He was working with us as an informant. When he went dark 11 months ago, we knew Meridian had discovered his investigation. But we couldn't prove anything without evidence. Agent Chin gestured toward the excavated burial site. This changes everything. Show me what you found. Over the next hour, Ella walked the federal agents through her entire investigation, from the buried backpack to the surveillance footage of Marcus Webb's finishing. The SD card she'd recovered contained not just evidence of the illegal burial operation, but detailed footage of the people involved, faces, license plates, and conversations that would prove invaluable in court. The crates, Agent Chen explained as her team began setting up a crime scene perimeter, contained military-grade weapons being smuggled to domestic terrorist cells. Meridian Industries was using their environmental permits as cover, claiming they needed access to remote forest locations for wildlife studies and soil sampling. In reality, they were running a trafficking network through national forest land. The pieces were falling into place. The hand-drawn map had marked burial sites throughout the forest, each one containing weapons caches that could be retrieved by buyers who knew the symbols and coordinates. The surveillance cameras monitored the sites to ensure the transactions went smoothly and to eliminate anyone who discovered the operation. Webb stumbled onto it by accident, Chen continued. He was investigating permit fraud, not trafficking. But once he realized what he'd found, he became too dangerous to ignore. As if summoned by their conversation, a commotion erupted near the tree line. The criminal who'd confronted Ella was being led out of the forest in handcuffs, his expensive hiking clothes torn from his flight through the undergrowth. Behind him came 2 more men, also in custody. Agent Chen smiled grimly. David Reeves, Meridian's head of security. Former military, specialized in making problems disappear. We've been trying to connect him to 3 other missing persons cases. Will you be able to prove he finished Marcus? Ella asked. With your surveillance footage? Absolutely. We'll also be excavating every location on that hand-drawn map. If Webb's body is still in the area, we'll find it. The crime scene team had erected floodlights around the burial site, and Ella watched as they began the methodical process of evidence collection. Every cigarette butt, every tire track, every disturbed piece of earth would be catalogued and analyzed. There's something else, Agent Chen said quietly. The weapons we intercepted from other Meridian sites were being distributed to extremist groups planning attacks on federal facilities. Your investigation didn't just solve a crime, it prevented what could have been a domestic terrorism catastrophe. Ella felt the weight of that revelation settle on her shoulders. What had started as a routine patrol to check on a dead trail camera had uncovered a criminal network that reached far beyond her forest, far beyond illegal dumping or environmental fraud. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Ella found herself thinking about Marcus Webb. His desperate voice on the tape recorder, his careful documentation of the criminal activity, his ultimate sacrifice in trying to expose the truth, none of it had been in vain. Agent Chen approached her one final time as the scene began to wind down. We're going to need you to testify when this goes to trial. Are you prepared for that? Ella looked around at the forest she'd protected for 8 years, thinking about all the secrets it had been hiding, all the dangers that had been lurking just beneath its peaceful surface. She thought about Trail Camera 47, still dark and silent in the woods, and about Marcus Webb, whose curiosity and courage had ultimately led to this moment. I'm ready, she said. 3 months later, Ella stood in a federal courthouse watching David Reeves and 12 other Meridian Industries employees receive sentences ranging from 25 years to life in prison. The trafficking network had been completely dismantled, the weapons recovered, and the terrorist plots prevented. Marcus Webb's body had been found buried at coordinates from his own map, along with enough evidence to ensure that everyone responsible for his death would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. As Ella walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sunshine, she thought about returning to Sector D7 tomorrow morning for her regular patrol. The forest would be peaceful again, its secrets finally exposed to the light. Trail Camera 47 was working perfectly now, monitoring nothing more dangerous than deer and hiking families. Sometimes the most routine patrol could change everything. She just hadn't expected it to save the country in the process.